A reading from Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, beginning at verse 14. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, "John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. This is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." But others said, "He is Elijah." And others said, "He is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old." But when Herod heard of it, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised." For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give to you, up to half of my kingdom." Then she went out and said to her mother, "For what should I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. In one sense, you can say that Herod had it all. He was, after all, king. He was a man with real power and the wealth that power often attracts. And he'd borne influence in his realm. He had courtiers around him, people who looked to him for favour, for preferment. Amongst all the Jews in Jerusalem, you would have thought that he had the greatest amount of power as well as the ability to wield it. And yet in this story, this account of John the Baptist's death, even for one as powerful and wealthy and influential as Herod, it all goes wrong. Herod ends up doing something he doesn't want to do, and John ends up beheaded. So what went wrong? Well, first of all, we must realise and re-emphasise the fact that John the Baptist was not really hated by Herod at all. Herod went to hear him, and he heard him gladly, we read in the passage. In fact, it even says that he was greatly perplexed, was the monarch, but he still went. So here we've got this kind of tug that John the Baptist has for Herod. Herod's perplexed by what he says. Maybe he sees the truth of it, but nonetheless he hears him gladly. He's not somebody who is looking to get rid of Herod. Now Herodias is, but not Herod. So what went wrong? Well, I think we can see in Herod's life a pattern which is there for all of us at different times and different stages. Let me explain what I mean. Let me bring a contrast for you between two of the people in this story, John the Baptist and Herod. Now, John is a man who's clearly obedient to the call of God. And he knew that to wade into the matter of the king's marriage was a dangerous thing to do. He knew it could cost him dear, but yet he still did it. He would act on the prompting that God gave him. Herod, though, although prompted, greatly perplexed, would not act on what he felt God was telling to do. John would preach, Herod would prevaricate. There's a difference between the two there, that response that they make to God, their reaction they make to God. Because it's one thing for God to communicate something to you, and it's another to act on it. The second contrast we might draw between the two of them is to do with stuff, God's provision. Now, John the Baptist was not a man with much money at all. After all, he wore camel hair, remember. He ate wild honey and locusts. Here was a man with not much at all. John was not a man of wealth, but Herod was. Herod had everything. And he was willing to spend that money however he wanted. He put on a lavish birthday party, and he was willing to, on oath, promise up to half his kingdom to the dancing girl. But in the end, as Psalm 24 reminds us, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. It wasn't Herod's wealth, really, to do with what he wished. Because, well, as we saw here, the earth is the Lord's. We are not owners, but rather we are stewards of that is given to us. For Herod, he had allowed the money to be viewed as something which was his, he could do with what he wanted. Whereas for John the Baptist, who followed a path of poverty, he realised that money is a good servant, but a poor master. In the end, all is of God, and so we must be careful and accountable for the way in which we steward the resources which have been given to us. After all, we say in the communion service, all things come from you, O Lord, and of your own do we give you. There's a freedom not to being not so concerned about possessions that they end up possessing you. The third contrast, well, that is to do with reputation. John would go out and preach regardless of what might happen. John would go out and preach even if it meant his reputation was so low that he may lose his life. Whereas Herod was a man who wanted to protect his reputation. It's telling, the phrase, that he did things because he was concerned about what other people would think. Because of his guests, we read. Herod wanted to save face, and in order for Herod to save face, John had to lose his head. But, as the Apostle Paul would remind us, we are not to be conformed to this world, but rather to be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Herod wanted to conform, but John was willing not to. This is the point of Paul's passage. Are we going to follow Herod and seek to conform to the world and seek its blessing and approval, or to follow the path of John and seek approval from God alone? Because in the end, it is not all those who are around us, it is not wider society who sits upon the throne at the final judgment, but God and God alone. So there you have it, Herod and John, one who looked around for approval, and one who simply looked up for approval. One who only listened, in Herod, and in John, one who acted on what he heard God prompting him to do. One who held all that he had close to him, in Herod, and John was the one who had nothing at all, who put it all into God's hands. In the end, Herod, as we can see in this passage, was haunted by his decision, thinking that Jesus was John the Baptist back from the dead. John, though, had a life transformed and died at peace with God. Two choices we have here how we might live. Do we live seeking the approval of God, or seeking the approval of those around us?